Here's something most men won't say out loud. Dating in your 30s and 40s is a completely different experience than it was a decade ago. And if you're a man who finds himself attracted to or actively pursuing women who are a little older, a little more seasoned, there are things you genuinely need to understand before you get in too deep. I'm not here to bash older women. That's not what this channel is about. What this channel is about is honest, grounded conversations about modern relationships, the kind of conversations that help you move through life with clarity instead of confusion. So today, we're having a real one. The harsh reality of dating older women. Stay with me. Let's start with the most important thing, and I want you to hear this carefully. Every person you date brings a history. Men and women alike. But when you date a woman who's in her late 30s or 40s, that history tends to be long, layered, and sometimes still unprocessed. Think about it. By the time a woman reaches 40, she may have had 1 or 2 serious long-term relationships, possibly a marriage, maybe children, and a series of experiences that have shaped how she sees herself, and more importantly, how she sees you. Now here's where it gets nuanced. Some of that history makes her extraordinary. She knows herself. She's lived. She's not going to play games the way a 22-year-old might. That maturity is genuinely attractive. But, and this is a big but, if she hasn't done the real internal work, that same history becomes a lens she unconsciously filters you through. Psychologists call this emotional transference, when past relationship experiences bleed into present ones. You don't text back fast enough, and suddenly you're the guy who used silence as control. You pull back slightly during a stressful week at work, and you're the emotionally unavailable ex from 2017. This isn't a character flaw. It's human. But you need to know it's possible before you find yourself confused about why a perfectly normal Tuesday turned into a referendum on your character. The question you want to ask, not on a first date, but as things develop, is, how does she talk about her past? Does she take any ownership? Or is every previous relationship a story of how someone failed her? There's wisdom in how people narrate their own history. A woman who has genuinely done the work, whether through therapy, introspection, time, or sheer lived experience, is going to be more self-aware. She's going to be able to tell you, hey, I know I get anxious when communication drops off. That's from an old pattern rather than making it your emergency. The difference between a woman who has processed her past and one who is still carrying it raw. That's one of the most important things you can learn to read. Here's something fascinating that most people don't want to talk about. The dating landscape looks very different depending on which direction age is moving. Research in evolutionary psychology consistently shows that men and women prioritize different things when selecting partners. Women, historically and across cultures, tend to place higher weight on status, stability, and resources. Men tend to place higher weight on physical indicators of youth and health. Neither of these things is a moral failing, they're deeply embedded behavioral patterns shaped over thousands of years. What this means practically is that a man who spent his 20s and 30s building himself, his career, his health, his confidence, his financial foundation, often finds that his attractiveness actually increases with age. He hits his 40s as what some researchers call a high-value social entity. Women who may not have noticed him before suddenly take notice. For women, the dynamic runs somewhat differently. A woman's perceived social desirability, particularly in the short-term mating market, tends to peak earlier and is more closely tied to biological signals of youth and fertility. By the time she's 40, she may find the dating market has narrowed in ways she didn't fully anticipate. Now, I want to be careful here because this is where a lot of channels go wrong. This doesn't mean older women aren't desirable. It doesn't mean they can't find incredible partners. Plenty do. What it does mean is that there's a real, lived asymmetry in how men and women experience aging in the context of dating, and if you're a man navigating this, you should understand it. If you've worked on yourself and reached a place of genuine success and self-mastery, you have more options than you may realize. That's not arrogance, that's just market awareness. And market awareness helps you make better decisions. The flip side? Don't let that awareness turn into entitlement or unkindness. Understanding that you have leverage is very different from wielding it carelessly over people who are just trying to find connection like everyone else. Okay, let's talk about something that trips a lot of men up, the gap between what an older woman says she wants and what she's actually responding to emotionally. You'll meet a woman in her early 40s who has her life together. Great career, her own home, a full social life. She'll tell you she's not looking for anything too serious, that she's independent, that she doesn't need a man to complete her. And she means all of that, consciously. But here's what's also true: human beings, regardless of gender, age, or how independent they've become, are wired for deep pair bonding. We are, at our biological core, social creatures who crave genuine intimacy and partnership. That doesn't disappear because you've built a successful solo life. If anything, it sometimes becomes more acute. So you'll find that the same woman who told you she's not looking for anything serious is suddenly pulling away and recalibrating when you're too casual, or getting deeply invested when you show up consistently and with intention. The subconscious is running a different program than the conscious narrative. This isn't manipulation, it's just the complexity of human psychology. But it means you need to be clear about what you want, too. Because unclear intentions with someone who is emotionally complex, that's a recipe for a lot of unnecessary pain on both sides. Be direct. Be honest early. I'm looking for something real and long-term, or I'm enjoying getting to know people right now without putting pressure on it. Either of those is fine. What's not fine is leaving it ambiguous so you can keep your options open while she's trying to figure out where she stands. Here's the broader principle. Dating older women rewards directness and emotional maturity. The games that might have worked at 25, playing it cool, manufactured scarcity, mixed signals, those tend to land very differently with someone who's been around long enough to recognize them immediately. This is the section most people skip over because it feels uncomfortable. But I'd rather have an honest conversation now than let you find out the hard way 6 months into something meaningful. If you're a man in your 30s or 40s who still wants biological children, and there's no shame in that, it's a completely valid and important desire, you need to be clear-eyed about the fertility realities when dating women in their 40s. The statistics on this are well documented by reproductive endocrinologists. A woman's fertility begins a meaningful decline around 35, and by 40, the chances of natural conception per cycle have dropped significantly. By 43 or 44, we're in a range where even assisted reproductive technology like IVF has substantially lower success rates, often under 10% per cycle using the woman's own eggs. Now, technology is advancing. Egg freezing has helped some women extend their options. Donor eggs are an option some couples pursue. And adoption is a beautiful path that many families walk. So it's not a closed door for everyone. But here's the honest truth: if having biological children is high on your priority list, and you're dating a woman who is 42 or older, you both need to have a frank, early conversation about this. Not a scary one, a caring one. Because the worst outcome is two people falling deeply in love, only to discover a year or two in that their family visions are fundamentally incompatible. And on the flip side, if you've already had children, or if family building isn't part of your picture at all, then this entire section may simply not apply to you. In which case, dating an older woman can be a genuinely rich, low-pressure experience with someone who already knows who she is. The key is alignment. Know what you want. Ask what she wants. Do it early, do it kindly, and do it clearly. Alright, we've been pretty honest about the challenges. So let's talk about what actually makes relationships with older women genuinely extraordinary, because when they work, they really work. First, the communication. A woman in her late 30s or 40s who has done the self-work is often a remarkably good communicator. She's had enough failed relationships to know that poor communication is usually the root cause. She's not going to drop hints and expect you to decode them. She's going to tell you. And that is worth so much. Second, the absence of performance. There's something deeply relaxing about dating someone who isn't trying to impress you with a version of themselves they think you want. Older women tend to have shed a lot of that. What you see is much closer to what you get. And that's incredibly rare in modern dating. Third, shared life stage. If you're both in your 40s, you're often in similar chapters. You both have careers. You both have your own lives and friendships. There's less codependency, less of the early relationship enmeshment that can make things feel simultaneously intense and fragile. You're two whole people choosing each other rather than two incomplete people trying to fill gaps. Fourth, she's often figured out what she actually finds attractive. Not the idea of something, the reality of it. She knows whether she values presence over grand gestures. She knows whether she needs intellectual connection or playfulness or loyalty to feel loved. She can tell you. And you get to decide if you're that person, rather than guessing. The relationships that work beautifully between men and older women share a common thread. Both people showed up with honesty, maturity, and a willingness to be vulnerable without being fragile. That's the combination. And honestly, it's the combination that makes any relationship work, but older partnerships tend to demand it sooner, which is ultimately a feature, not a bug.